Are you confident that they would call off operations, the IDF, if they felt that civilians were in danger?
Short answer to that is I'm confident that is their procedure. I can't vouch for every single operation that they have conducted. I can say that the operational procedures that they have are, in terms of the laws of armed conflict, are as strong as ours. They then have on top of that rules which things that we have never done, such as dropping leaflets to tell where attacks are taking place.
Since the outbreak of war, the Israeli Defence Force has been accused of the reckless use of force and the murders of civilians. In today's Times, one former NATO commander is suggesting that the Israeli military's rules of engagement in Gaza are at least as rigorous as those of the British Army. Let's talk to General Sir John McColl, former Deputy Supreme Allied Commander Europe. General Sir John, good afternoon to you.
Good afternoon.
When were you in Gaza?
Last week.
OK, and you were with, I think, quite a few other representatives of other NATO countries.
Yeah, there were 6 NATO countries represented on the trip, all with previous military experience and experience in various other theatres.
And you have served, I should say, with the British Army for nearly 40 years and in all sorts of different conflicts?
Yes, in a number of different conflicts, in various different operational theatres. Exactly that.
So when you were on the ground in Gaza, were you accompanied the entire time by IDF representatives?
No, we were not. Most of the time we had civilian hosts. And I would say that I went there sceptical. I went there with the views of probably the majority of people in this country, that there was a reckless use of force and that the IDF approach to operations needed review. And so I didn't go there as somebody who's going to promote the views of the IDF or indeed those of any Israeli institutions. I went there skeptical, and I made it clear before I went that I would not be saying anything positive unless I saw something positive to talk about.
So can I just ask, before we get on to what you saw, how you'd formed your original assessment that perhaps the IDF had behaved badly?
Well, I formed it from taking an interest in affairs in Israel, from reading the newspapers, absorbing the media commentary on the way in which the war was being conducted.
OK, so you had seen enough and felt you'd heard enough to make the assessment that they could behave in a more responsible fashion. So when you were on the ground...
Well, yeah, so I'm just sorry to interrupt, but I think I would say that my views probably represented the views of the majority of people in this country who had taken an interest in what was going on in Israel and in Gaza.
So what surprised you most about what you saw last week?
Well, we started off by going to the sites of the massacre of the 7th of October. So we started off on the kibbutz, one of the kibbutzes, and then we went to the site of the music festival. And we saw video footage taken from the head cams of Hamas fighters, terrorists, and saw them chopping people's heads off with knives and hose. We saw them shooting women, children, and then singing about it afterwards. So the sheer brutality of it was shocking, and a reminder, as I put in the article I wrote, a reminder of the barrier that exists in between where we are now and any resolution. And that was really a reminder that Israel can't let that threat stand on their borders. No nation could. And Hamas have said that they would wish to do it again if they possibly could. So that was the first thing, a reminder of just how savage the attacks were. And then we went from there, and we received briefings from operational commanders who had just finished commanding in Gaza, and they talked to us about the operations they were conducting. And this is important because of the complexity of it. And they talked about dealing with suicide bombers and civilians, human shields. They spoke about booby traps, operating in densely populated areas with a heavily armed and well-trained enemy. Now, those factors make a very, very complex environment, particularly in an urban environment. But they are in many ways similar to that which we found in Fallujah back in 2004. What is different about this environment is that underneath the Gaza Strip, 25 miles by 7, there are, well, already discovered 200 kilometers of tunnels, possibly 500 kilometers of tunnels. It is an absolute honeycomb. And so in those tunnels, you find command and control centers, logistics centers. Indeed, there were jails where the hostages were being held. And the tunnels were coming up in front of Israeli troops, to the flanks of the IDF, and behind the IDF. And those tunnels were booby-trapped. And so moving through them, clearing them, was immensely complex, much more complex than anything that I have ever seen before. And indeed, any of the nations represented had seen before. And it resulted in the IDF commander describing that in order to conduct operations, they had to actually invert their operational planning process. So they began underground and then moved to the surface troops and then to the air troops. Now, the reason that that's important, and the reason I emphasize it, is because it then makes the next issue, which is, I think, the nub of the issue, which is the question of the rules of engagement, the laws which control how soldiers use force in operational environments, how difficult they are to implement in an operational environment such as that.
So are you confident? I don't want to interrupt you because you're a man who's with immense life experience, and you have been to Gaza, and not just Gaza. But are you confident that they would call off operations, the IDF, if they felt that civilians were in danger?
Short answer to that is I'm confident that is their procedure. I can't vouch for every single operation they have conducted. I can say that the operational procedures that they have are, in terms of the laws of armed conflict, are as strong as ours. They then have on top of that rules things that we have never done, such as dropping leaflets to tell where attacks are taking place, what's called knocking, which is to put a small munition on top of the building to indicate which building is going to be hit, and sending phone calls and indeed texts to areas where strikes are going to happen. So I can say that those are the rules that they have. Those that I'm satisfied that those that I spoke to, and we did go into Rafah then, having spoken to the operational commanders and the legal department, we then went into Rafah and questioned, and I have to say question hard, operational commanders, and saying, how are you implementing this? Are you calling off missions where you think civilians are in danger? And they said yes. Now, I'm satisfied that those rules are robust. I'm satisfied the intent is there. What I can't say to you is that they are being observed in every single circumstances. What I can also say, by the way, is that they have a very strict investigative procedure for where they think it has gone wrong. So,
okay. Well, I was about to ask, of course, that in spite of what you believe to be their best efforts, tens of thousands of entirely innocent women, children, and men have been killed. I mean, there is no escaping that, is there?
There is no escaping the fact that there have been, I think, in excess of 40,000 casualties, as the figure you have. Well, that's the figure I have, and that has, of course, come from, the figure I've seen has come from Hamas. So your suggestion that I think you were suggesting that they were entirely innocent civilians, I think is open to question.
In what sense? Because these are people who, in many cases, were held hostage effectively by a brutal terrorist organisation. Honestly, what does a woman of 26 with 4 children, what can she possibly do to prevent Hamas ruling her life?
Well, I absolutely agree. That is a dreadful dilemma. Perhaps the challenge is if you have an organization like Hamas on your doorstep, who are prepared to murder 1,200 people in a day and sever people's heads from their bodies, it is necessary to go and make sure that threat no longer exists on your border. I mean, these are terrible dilemmas, and I'm not making light of them, but I'm just saying that there is an alternative perspective to look upon the way in which the Israelis are conducting operations in a highly complex, highly difficult environment in which they're doing what I regard as their absolute level best to minimise the level of security and civilian casualties. I would also say that I think it's extremely important, and I was critical of the IDF on this. It's extremely important to get independent, objective media reporting into Gaza to allow the debate that we're having to be opened up to objective analysis by individuals.
And how likely is that? Because it hasn't happened so far, has it?
Well, it is. I mean, what the Israelis would say, and I did say that to them. I said that to them right up the chain of command to the highest level. What they would say is they're concerned about the safety of reporters, and I think there's a valid point to make there. But I think that is something they must and should get round. And they would also be concerned, frankly, about some of what they claim is some of the bias of reporting. But I think that's something that they need to put to one side. They need to open it up. They need to be objective. In my view, they have a different perspective to that which currently prevails across most of the media to put to the media. And if they're confident in it, they should be prepared to open up to them.
Well, quite. And it will be interesting to see if that does happen in the short term. Just very briefly, General Sir John, if you don't mind, having seen all this and spoken to so many people with pretty firm views last week, do you think a ceasefire is in any way possible in the near future?
To say that that's a political question, and I deliberately have strayed away from getting into the political area. I think it's going to be extremely difficult, but I think it must happen. It must happen. The idea of destroying Hamas completely within the environment that exists in Gaza, I don't think is possible, and therefore some sort of accommodation must and should be reached. I would just finish by saying one thing, and that is the other criticism I have of the IDF and Israeli strategy is that the moment it is fighting, just fighting, and violence leads to more fighting and more violence, there must be a political objective which they all need to work towards. And at the moment, as far as I can see, there is no political objective. In other words, a proposed solution for the day after.
I very much appreciate your time. Thank you very much. That's General Sir John McColl, former Deputy Supreme Allied Commander in Europe.